and welcome to Dialogue. Relations between the U.S. and Europe are facing a profound shift. At forums like the Munich Security Conference, European analysts have warned that the U.S. EU relations are becoming more transactional, more unpredictable, and less anchored in the assumptions that shaped the post-Cold War order. European policymakers are openly discussing ideas once considered taboo, from strategic autonomy in defense to recalibrating economic and political ties with Washington. So what is driving this widening gap? Is this a temporary rupture linked to the current Trump administration, or a deeper shift in how Europe and the U.S. see each other? And what might a new balance in the transatlantic relationship look like? Join us for our discussion today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Ulrich Brueckner, Professor of Political Science at Stanford University in Berlin, Professor Diesen at the University of South-Eastern Norway, and Anton Fedyashin, Associate Professor at American University. Welcome to the show. Let's start with the Munich Security Report for 2026, which argues that global politics entered an era of what it calls wrecking ball politics, where the deliberate disruption of existing rules and institutions has become a defining feature, particularly under the current U.S. administration. So I will start with Professor Brueckner. What do you make of this definition here?
Well, I think strategically, if you organize an event like this that gets more and more attention every year, you set a tone that might sound a bit more like alarmism compared with what's actually going on. So it fuels the debate and it helps to look at the different dimensions that world affairs are facing these days. For my taste, it's a bit too much, but I perfectly understand that the organizers set a tone like this.
Professor Diesen, so definitely, maybe the world is not exactly like that, but it's obviously different from the so-called rules-based international order.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I think that the relationship between the United States and Europe will change profoundly. And because in the bipolar era and the unipolar era, our interests were almost identical, as we had either the interest of collectively balancing the Soviet Union or pursuing collective hegemony after the Cold War. What I think now is the recognition that this was temporary. That is, as the unipolar world order is over, essentially the US exhausted itself to a large extent. It now faces collective balancing. A lot of the relationship with the Europeans has to change. That is, the United States realizes that in a multipolar world, it has to prioritize. It wants to then make sure that it's the leading power in the Western Hemisphere. And it also wants to be in Asia to try to contain China because it sees China as its main adversary. Now, this means that they will have less resources for Europe. So there will have to be a pivot away from Europe. And so with key institutions like NATO, they can't have the same role. In the unipolar world order, it had this purpose it was essentially NATO expansion was the manifestation of this hegemonic vision of Europe or collective hegemony. But in the multipolar world, it does the opposite. It commits the US excessively to Europe when it should pivot other places. And it also pushes Russia too far towards China. So the United States doesn't have the same interest anymore in NATO. So this makes perfect sense. And I think in the multipolar world, the interest of the US and the Europeans will increasingly go their separate ways. So this is why I think the Europeans should begin not to consider a complete divorce from the US or see it as an enemy, but the relationship definitely has to be redefined.
Okay, relationship has to be redefined. Anton Fedyashin, Professor, do you also agree, especially from the Washington's perspective, so their interests is increasingly, let's say, not aligned with that of the Europeans?
Under the Trump administration, definitely not. And there have been multiple signs of this, including J.D. Vance's famous speech several months ago, which scandalized the Europeans, not to mention pretty much every tweet that comes from under the fingers and thumbs of Donald Trump. I agree with Ulrich. He makes a very good point about the slight sensationalism behind this. For me, the question is, where have the Europeans been all the time that has led up to this report, which officially, by the way, I'm looking at it, is called Under Destruction. I remember in 2020, the Munich Security Conference issued a report whose title was Westlessness. In other words, 6 years ago, intelligent people already understood where things are going, that they were moving towards multipolarity, that the West was not going to play the formative role that it had played in global geopolitics for, by the way, about 300 to 400 years. But over the past 6 years, the Europeans have done a surprisingly small amount to actually prepare for this. The Trump administration, in part, correctly sort of looks at the population relationship between the United States and Europe, or rather the EU, I should say. The EU has about 450 million people. The US has about 340 million people. And the Trump administration is asking the perfectly reasonable question about why 340 are basically paying for the security of 450. And the Trump administration wasn't the first to ask this question. Let's remember that it's under Barack Obama that the United States really started pushing NATO members to contribute more of their GDP for the alliance's security. And that was a very slow process, although European countries did begin to increase their spending, but it's the slowness with which Europe makes decisions that seem to make the situation in which it finds itself with every Munich Security Conference that much more severe.
Mm-hmm. We will go into details about the relationship, as the show continues. But let's also mention another report by the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, which suggests a radical new framework for Europe to treat the U.S. Not as a permanent ally, but simultaneously as a partner, competitor, and a rival, depending on the issue, ultimately aiming for strategic autonomy. Professor Brueckner, of course, the spending on the military, the Washington has complained for many, many years. That's a reality. But the annexation or the attempt to annex the Greenland is a different story, and that probably helped the European side realize the U.S. is different from the previous one.
Well, if we put the two statements together, what Glenn and Anton just said, then as long as there is something like a common denominator for transatlantic relations, there's no need to spend as much as Anton is asking for. Now, the situation is not about should the Europeans spend more or should they declare strategic autonomy, but the question is, what are the threats? And if there's something like an open threat to a NATO member and its territory from another NATO member, this is a fundamentally different situation compared with everything Europeans have experienced since World War II. And on top of it, it's not just a question of what intelligent people see as a future situation. We are not living in a European political system with strongmen being the leaders, but we are a pluralist society in which public opinion defines the room for maneuver for democratically elected governments. So that's radically different from China, the current US administration, or the Kremlin. And having said this, it defines in the public discourse what's possible. And a few years ago, it was simply not possible to even dream of something like 5% of GDP spending on defense.
Well, in the face of this, Europe is, I would say, seriously discussing ideas like a stronger European pillar within NATO, and even exploring a European nuclear deterrent based on French and British capabilities. An idea once dismissed, but now seriously considered by German leadership. So, Glenn, I mean, how realistic it is, in terms of pursuing defense autonomy from Washington? We rely on ourselves. We also have nuclear powers, and we have, the European continent is a rich one. They have money to spend. So it's about a political will. It's about, there's no lack of a capability, right?
Well, I think this is not a new thing either. That is, for years and years, the EU put this into its documents that it wanted to develop strategic autonomy, which loosely translates into a bit more independence from the United States. So this was an EU goal for a very long time now. But you have to operationalize this somehow. And what exactly would this entail? How do you have autonomy for a group of countries? Here 27. Well, first you need some self-sufficiency. This especially in the tech sector. The Europeans never moved forward really significantly on this. But the second you can also do is to diversify your partnerships. That is, don't develop excessive dependence on a more powerful actor like the United States. And here as well, the Europeans should have diversified. They should have better deals with China, with Russia, because ironically, if you want better relationship with the United States, you can't be completely beholden. The Europeans now seem surprised that he can just call on the EU leaders to show up at his golf course in Scotland and sign whatever he puts in front of them. But this is what happens when you develop excessive dependence. So, and again, this is part of the problem. The Europeans, not just security, but economically, but they tend to do this to themselves, I think. You see this with China. Why would the EU cut back on economic ties with China at the time when the US becomes more assertive? And Russia as well. This was a necessity for the Europeans to industrialize and to have a big market, especially when the Russians saw Europe as their preferential partner. But again, a lot of the policies have been essentially to follow the US into these very foolish policies, not just the proxy war on Russia, but also this economic war with China. So I don't think a lot of what the EU has ambitions for now can actually be achieved, because I think the strength of the EU was to be an economic actor, use this collective bargaining power of 27 states to negotiate a better position, have political influence, and it also had incentives if they can deliver actual economic benefits to its member states. The problem now that you want to have this geopolitical EU is that there's it makes very little sense that 27 very different countries are going to have the same foreign policy interests. So you end up with essentially framing everything in moralism and irrational as good versus evil. If you look at the Europeans' discourse, for example, around the war in Ukraine, if you would allow any nuance and discussion, then you wouldn't be able to there's no reason why Ireland and Greece and Latvia should all have the same policy, but there's no permission of this. So from my perspective, this is also cutting off Europe's ability to act as a geoeconomic actor, to provide economic benefits for its member states. So a lot of what it's done, it should have done exactly the opposite. That is to diversify, and this dividing lines in Europe, move away from this concept of a geopolitical EU and go back to the geoeconomic foundation of it.
Back to Professor Brueckner, what's your response to what Glenn has said about, the European Union itself, for example, as an economic power, somehow they also, let's say, make concessions to the U.S. in terms of tariff from Washington. In the reality, they are capable of protecting themselves from the tariffs, right? But they didn't do that.
Well, they didn't do it because they chose to de-escalate whenever possible. Because already announcing that this could be the beginning of a trade war would have so many very practical implications, and the costs would be immediately high, that it's better to sit down in Scotland and pretend that you agree to buy 10 times the amount of natural gas from the United States than you have ever imported before. Nobody knows who needs this. Nobody knows if the United States will ever produce them, but it looks like a great deal. And then this problem could be solved because something else will be in the headlines instead. So this was the strategy until in Greenland, the situation became so much out of control that they had to change their strategy. and then they learn from experience and know at what point they play hardball and at what point de-escalation is the better option.
Okay, but Professor Brueckner, so in a sense, it's a lack of skills, a lack of experience to deal with Trump, a bully here. But at least on the issue of Greenland, we do see this strong solidarity of European nations, siding with Denmark and against Trump, and they succeeded, right?
Yeah, but it's not just a question of what would be tactical wise or what's the long-term strategy. Because as I said before, it all depends on the circumstances. Glenn mentioned a number of them, but there are many more. It's also a question of who's currently in office, what are the results of the upcoming elections in France, what is happening in Britain. We are all facing major economic challenges domestically, including China. And then depending on how we are dealing with it, that defines, to Trump would say, what cards we have in the negotiations. So I don't expect anything like a very clear picture of what this relationship will be in the nearer future, because a lot of these factors change while we speak. And therefore, in the end, it will be a bit of a mishmash of everything.
Are you saying that so there's no clear trend in terms of the nature of the relationship? It depends on specific issues?
Well, it will depend a lot on what is actually the threat perception. And this has a lot to do with, will we see a solution with Ukraine? Can we buy time? What is the economic situation? What's the domestic situation after the midterm elections in the United States? All of these factors play in defining who sees itself in what position, and that will shape the negotiations.
Well, Glenn, as I said, we do see strong solidarity on the issue of Greenland. Of course, that's about, a very strong principle of sovereignty, right, of territorial integrity. Is there a possibility for the European nations or European Union to be united against the U.S. on other issues when there's differences arise?
No, and well, I guess I would also contest some of the premise that they showed this great solidarity, because they were extremely cautious. Indeed, when the Germans sent some troops, the U.S. threatened some tariffs, and they left the next day. Furthermore, then the U.S., the Europeans came along and tried to excuse themselves, trying to suggest that, well, we only sent the troops there because we want to protect it from China or Russia, which doesn't make any sense at all. And obviously it was a tripwire against the United States. But this was kind of the reaction after the U.S. threatened to use military force to annex European territory, and they made excuses for themselves to even send a handful of troops. So I'm not sure. I wouldn't agree there was such a forceful display of unity. But no, overall, I think that, I agree with what was said before. I think Trump is the president of low-hanging fruit. That is, he wants something a lot for something little, like the way he was able to squeeze concessions out of a few threats to Panama. He wanted to swing in by one-day operation in Venezuela, kidnap the president. Once things go wrong, like in Yemen or Iran, he wants to put a quick end to it. So he doesn't want to get bogged down. He wants, there's a new week, he needs a new escapade. So for this reason, I think that it was quite predictable that if the Europeans show that they're willing to put a lot on the line, that then he will step away, as opposed to show that they're able to be bullied around. The problem we keep referring to Europe as if it would be one entity. Again, with EU with 27 states, how do you respond to a multipolar world? Because some countries will say, well, we just have to bow to the United States, hope that things might be different in the future, just appease Trump and who's ever in Washington, and hopefully our obedience will be rewarded. And then you have others who make the point, no, actually, if we want to be treated properly, we have to show that we have other partners. We have to diversify. Well, these are two completely opposing policies. So how can you have 27 countries agree on this? And so I think the EU will always be vulnerable to external powers seeking to divide them. The problem is that they put themselves in a position where countries like the United States and Russia have every reason in the world to divide them, exactly because of their policy. But this is going back to the idea of the limitations of a forceful EU foreign policy. It was, the Italian Prime Minister and also President of the European Commission, Romano Prodi, he made the point that the EU was a giant with clay feet. It can look big and impressive, but once it starts to try to walk, it will fall apart. And I think this is the reason why it should have stayed a bit out of this business of geopolitics. It should have diversified its economic ties because that's in the national interest of its member states. But I think it's been playing too many games, and now it's reaping the consequence of this.
Mm-hmm. Anton, if you look at the differences between Washington and Brussels, so it's beyond the spending military. If you look at the U.S. national security strategic strategy, and President Trump, which has been exceptionally critical of Europe, describing it as facing, quote, civilizational decline, and suggested that the U.S. should cultivate political forces inside EU to change its trajectory. That's clear. A blatant promotion of interference of internal affairs, of countries like Germany, right? Supported AfD. How do you look at the differences? Is there differences of values, of a culture here?
Well, this is a question of political preferences. Donald Trump sees himself as the ultimate conservative. And so does J.D. Vance, and they are clearly referring to stimulating and supporting conservative political parties across Europe. The difference between Trump and previous presidents is that Trump doesn't have a filter. He doesn't bother to clothe naked geopolitical and even political interests in the language of human rights and democracy promotion and all of that business that we're all terribly used to. But in that sense, he is no different, really, from any previous American administration, going all the way back to the middle of the 20th century. Students of the Cold War know very well the degree to which the United States meddled in other countries' domestic affairs, including, by the way, its Western allies, swinging elections in Italy and influencing elections in Greece, all over the world. So none of this is new. In the past 40 years, we've had a cascade of disastrous regime change experiments, which are essentially the same thing. So now that the Europeans are on the receiving side of this, they certainly mind much more than when they stood next to the United States, interfering in the affairs of other countries, such as Libya, for example, or Iraq, for that matter. So look, none of this is new. The United States has done a lot of good in the world over the past century that it has been a global player. But it is also, and this is what people very often forget, the United States is a great power, and all great powers can act ruthlessly, chillingly ruthlessly, which the United States has also done. Ask the Latin Americans about their experience with the U.S. in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s of the previous century, and you'll get an earful about that. So I don't see anything as having fundamentally changed, except that the Europeans are now on the receiving end of American meddling. And the best that the Europeans can do, and now we do have to sort of speak in terms of individual countries, is to maintain the integrity of their democracies and to respect the wishes of their people, which, by the way, with the experience of Romania, with its attempt at a presidential election last year, is questionable. And here, the EU leadership in Brussels, unfortunately, played a role in helping the Romanian government simply cancel an election that wasn't going its way. So there are a lot of, everyone is at a crossroads. And for me, the interesting thing about the report and what we'll be hearing at the speeches at the Munich Security Conference is to see whether the Europeans are ready to manage multipolarity or if they are going to resist it. Because if they try to resist it, it will simply catalyze the process to happen even faster.
Mm-hmm. Professor Brueckner, do you think the European Union is ready to manage it, multipolarity?
Well, it depends on what multipolarity will look like. The European Union is certainly not an actor compared with other global powers, as Glenn pointed out, and also what the nature of a system that is much more navel-gazing as a concept of respecting the rights of even the smallest member and focusing on economic integration and not trying to play a role as a geopolitical actor. Now they learn the hard way that they have to take a position to defend of what Anton just pointed out is the essence of what this organization is about. Whether they will manage to survive under those conditions, this is definitely too early to tell.
Mm-hmm. Anton, the German security report argues that the transatlantic relationship has changed permanently, regardless of who wins the next U.S. election. But others suggest a change in administration could at least manage the tensions better. So what's your opinion? So is this a permanent division or a temporary one? And restoration could be made after the change of the host in the White House?
It depends on which aspect of the relationship we're talking about. So, for example, the requirement by the United States for NATO members to increase their defense spending is a permanent feature. And is that a change? Yes, it is. Is it qualitative? We'll see how the Europeans manage to direct that spending. The Germans, for example, have decided to put a lot of the increased defense spending into road building, which, by the way, is a brilliant idea. Infrastructure is an integral part of warfare, and they've essentially rerouted that spending towards domestic logistics. And I'm sure that other European countries will come up with similar domestically oriented programs. But if we're talking about the general strategic balance relationship, let me put it that way, between the United States and Europe, I don't think that 4 years of Trump, no matter how destructive to business as usual it may become in the next 3 years, I don't think it's going to really change that relationship. Certainly not with the war in Ukraine going on, because the Europeans have completely freaked themselves out about this Russian threat that they imagine in every corner of their house. And instead of sort of preparing for it, this has driven them into greater dependence on the United States. They keep talking about putting troops in Ukraine and doing stuff for Ukraine, but only if there's an American backstop, which essentially means that we're going to do, great things for Ukraine as long as the Americans are doing it for us. In that sense, I think the strategic imbalance within NATO and in EU-US relations is going to continue once Trump leaves, because here in Washington, there are equally powerful forces that want to see Europe be dependent on the United States, both economically and in terms of security. And unfortunately, those two spheres have become inextricably tied together.
On that note, we're coming to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Qin Zhuo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.